Welcome to repairing a 5-inch gauge Modelworks Pannier tank, part 3, fitting larger, heavy-duty compression springs to the axle boxes to allow the suspension more travel, and fixing the boiler feed water hand pump. This is how the suspension works. Each axle box is fitted with 2 pieces of studding that sticks out underneath. These are fitted with a pair of compression springs as shown here. The springs are held in place by a special plate which is fastened to the studding using a pair of lock nuts. In my workshop over the years I have accrued quite a collection of different types of springs, but unfortunately none of the ones that I have are the right size or strength. So believe it or not, I had to buy some more from Blackgates Engineering. Looking at the difference in these springs, I really do think that the one on the right hand side is possibly going to be a bit too long and a bit too strong for the job. And because the internal diameter of these new springs is too big, I'm going to use some small pieces of silicone rubber model aircraft fuel tubing to make up the difference. Initially I thought that 2 short pieces like this would be okay, as they would centralise the springs. And after I fitted each of the pieces of silicone rubber tubing, I applied a little bit of oil to make the springs slide over the silicone rubber tubing. So far so good. But this job did get exponentially much more difficult. Even though I already know this job is not going to be successful, I soldiered on and got on with it. I realised this job wasn't going to work by the amount of physical effort that I had to put in just to refit the hanger plates. And now for the first top tip time in this episode. I use a screwdriver behind the wheel to lever the hanger plate into position. Then I use the small socket to tighten the nuts onto the ends of both spring hangers. And already there is a problem. The springs are compressed far too much. To use these springs, the spring hangers need to be a lot longer than they are. Then they're going to get in the way and foul things on the track. So I have to work within the constraints of the design of the locomotive. This part of the video is actually out of sequence. I removed both pairs of springs from both of the axle boxes. After doing this, I found that the axle boxes were quite a tight fit in the horn blocks. In this clip I'm fitting the 2 pieces of silicone rubber to centralise the springs, followed by sliding the new springs into place over the top of the silicone rubber tubing. And here, in exactly the same way as I've previously shown, I'm fitting the first of the lock nuts on the end of the spring hangers. The only problem is, though, to fit another lock nut is going to further compress the springs, and there's going to be hardly any suspension. Once 2 pairs of these springs were fitted to the rear axle box, I put the entire unit onto the rolling road, but only supporting the engine by the front axle and the rear axle. And here you can see there is a bit of travel, but it's very rigid and not smooth. The pressure of these springs is actually holding the axle box very square in the horn blocks. And also I found out that the pieces of silicone rubber tubing that are fitted are a bit small and don't support the inner diameter as well as they should be doing. The only solution is to remove the spring hanger bracket, remove the springs, and remove the pieces of silicone rubber tubing, and fitting 2 longer pieces of silicone rubber tubing in their place. Now the job is suddenly more difficult because the springs are taking a lot more pressure to compress. The second top tip time of this episode shows how I fit the nuts to the end of the hangers. I use a small piece of silicone rubber tubing in the socket which holds the nut right at the end of the socket, making it very easy to screw it in place. Did I say very easy? Well, I didn't really mean that. It was quite difficult because of the pressure that I had to put on the hanger plate to hold the parts in place in order to do this. I'm using Loctite 243 thread locker because I don't think there's going to be any room for lock nuts. I'm not going to show each and every axle. Suffice to say, here I've fitted the springs to the centre axle, using exactly the same method as previously shown with a piece of silicone rubber tubing in the end of the socket. Necessity is the mother of invention. This job seemed to get harder the more I did it. Maybe I was just getting weaker, because manual compression of a pair of these springs is quite difficult to do. Here I'm using a pair of very long nose pliers through the hole in the handle of my Barco spanner to lever the part into place. I got there in the end, and the entire job that you've just seen, believe it or not, took 2.5 hours to complete. Now, with all the new stiffer springs fitted, I connected the airline as shown in the previous episode, winding it around the buffer in case it comes loose and flails about. I opened the valve on the compressor to 50 psi. The engine runs, but it doesn't sound too good. The sound is a lot harder. Time to think again. It's worth mentioning though, at this stage the locomotive does not have tanks full of water and the boiler is empty, so the engine isn't applying quite as much weight to the axles as it would be in running condition. My experience tells me that this is not right at all. It doesn't sound right. The springs cannot compress sufficiently because under compression the spring coils touch each other and won't go any further. I'm not happy with the way the engine is performing. Time for plan B. The other set of springs I ordered from Blackgates Engineering arrived this morning in the post. The high point of this episode is the next part. This is a special top tip time. Miniature steam engines often need recommissioning. For instance, in one of the side tanks, this boiler feed hand pump is stuck fast. It is completely seized up, it will not move, it is a non-hand pump. It is currently deceased. Even though I insert a lever into it, it doesn't move at all. I wonder what the answer is. I think it's time to have a cup of tea. My tea of preference is Earl Grey in a tea bag. In no time at all, the kettle boils and switches off, and I add the just under boiling point water to the cup with the tea bag in it. And in no time at all I have a really nice cup of tea. Then I take the kettle into the workshop and pour some of the nearly boiling water onto the pump inside the tank. And it still doesn't move, but then suddenly it does move, and immediately the hand pump works perfectly. Flush with success, I had a bit of a pumping frenzy while my cup of tea was brewing in the kitchen next to the workshop. The rattling sound you can hear is the sound that the ball valves make when, by using the lever, I'm moving the pump ram back and forth. And yes, it is as simple as that. I don't know much about black holes, event horizons or singularity, but I do understand the principle of thermal shock. That's it for this episode. Time for a nice cup of Earl Grey tea. Stay safe, stay healthy, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.